Everyone who tells this story tells it wrong, and I have decided, after 3 years of listening to them get it wrong, that I will set it down the way it actually happened. Not the way the court prefers to remember it, all polished edges and a tidy villain, but the way it looked from the inside, on the night the whole thing balanced on the word of one man who was never supposed to be important. My name is Iris Marlowe. For 11 years I served in the household of Queen Saralind of Eldermoor, first as a reader of correspondence and later as the woman who sat closest to her in the small hours, the one trusted with the letters no clerk could see and the worries no minister could hear. I was not a guard. I have never held a rifle in my life. I could not have stopped what was coming that night if I had thrown my whole body across the corridor. But I was there for the hours in the Queen's private study when the meaning of it unfolded piece by piece, and I watched her face change, and I saw the exact moment the ground went out from under her, and she could not find a single word to say. That moment is the reason I am writing this at all. People love the part where the guard stops the woman. They tell it in the servants' hall, and they tell it to visiting cousins, and it grows a little grander each time. But the part that mattered, the part that left the Queen of Eldermoor standing in her own study with her hand pressed flat against her mouth. Nobody tells that right, because most of them never knew what she read on that folded page. I knew. I was the one holding the lamp. Let me begin where it truly began, which was not in the corridor at all but 3 days earlier, with a cough. Princess Maelin was 8 that spring, a small, grave, watchful girl who asked questions the way other children breathe, without pause and without mercy. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking, and she had, that week, a cough. Nothing more than that. A child's cough, dry and stubborn, the kind that follows a wet march. The palace physician, old Dr. Haveston, listened to her chest and pronounced it a passing thing, prescribed honey and rest and the closing of the drafty east windows, and thought no more about it. Neither did the Queen, not really. Children cough. The world turns. But somewhere in the palace, and this is the thing that took us so long to understand, someone had been waiting a very long time for exactly such a small, ordinary, deniable thing. A cough is nothing, but a cough can be made into something. A cough can be written up. A cough can become, in the right hands and on the right paper, a reason. I did not know any of that on the night it happened. On the night it happened, I knew only what everyone in the residential wing knew, that the princess had a cough, that the household had been told to keep the wing quiet, and that a specialist was expected. That last part had come down through the proper channels, or what looked like the proper channels, a note 2 days before, informing the residential staff that a consulting physician of children's diseases would be attending the princess, and that her visit might fall at an unusual hour, the specialists being busy people who kept irregular clocks. The note bore the seal of the Lord Chamberlain's office. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Notes with that seal governed half our lives. The delivery of coal and the ordering of candles, and the movement of every visitor through those gates came down under that seal. It was as ordinary as the weather. So when a woman in a dark traveling coat presented herself at the residential entrance at 11:15 on a cold Thursday night, with a physician's bag in one gloved hand and a folded document in the other, and said in a calm, cultured voice that she was Dr. Cachevel, come to attend the Princess Maelin, the understeward on duty, did precisely what he had been trained to do. He checked her name against the note. He found it there, Dr. Cachevel, consulting physician, written in the Chamberlain's own clerkly hand. He checked the seal on the paper she carried and found it genuine, or genuine enough for a tired man at the end of a long day who had been told to expect exactly this. And he sent her up. He sent her up. I have thought a great deal in the years since about that understeward. His name was Perrin, and he was not a fool and not a traitor and not asleep at his post. He was a careful, decent man who had been handed a lie so well made that carefulness itself became the trap, because everything he had been trained to check checked out. The note was real. The name matched. The seal was true. Every gate he was told to guard, she had a key to. The people who built this thing had built it precisely for men like Perrin, men who did their duty by the book, because the whole cruelty of it was that the book had been written for them. There was only one thing in the entire palace that night that the plotters had not been able to forge, and it was not a seal or a signature or a document. It was a man's judgment. His name was Bram Ashcott. He was a sergeant of the household guard, 38 years old, 12 years in service, and he had the post that no guard covets and every family with children secretly depends upon, the night watch of the residential corridor, the long, portrait-lined hall on the third floor of the west wing where the royal children slept. It is a lonely post and a boring one, or it is meant to be. A man can stand it for a decade and never see anything worse than a prince sneaking down to the kitchens or a nightmare sending a small figure padding toward its mother's rooms. Ashcott had stood it for 6 years. He knew every ordinary sound that corridor made in the dark, the settling of the old timbers, the tick of the landing clock, the particular creak of the fourth stair. He knew the night staff by their footsteps before he knew them by their faces. He knew the way a man knows the inside of his own house, what belonged there and what did not. And a stranger, walking that corridor toward the princess's door at 11 at night, did not belong there, no matter what paper she carried, no matter whose seal was on it, no matter that the whole apparatus of the palace had already waved her through. That is the thing the tidy version leaves out. By the time Dr. Cachavel reached the top of the west stair, she had passed every test the palace could set her. She had been checked and matched and sealed and approved. Perrin had done his duty and the note had done its work, and the machine of the household had turned exactly as it was built to turn. Every official thing about her was in order. She was, by every rule written down anywhere in Harrowgate Palace, permitted to be exactly where she was. Only one man, standing in the dark at the head of that corridor, was not part of the machine and would not be moved by paper. I have heard people say since that Ashcott was suspicious of her. That is not what he told the Queen, and it is not, I think, the truth. He was not suspicious in the way you are suspicious of a thief. Suspicion is a loud thing, a jumping to. What Ashcott had was quieter and older and far harder to argue with, and when he tried to explain it to Her Majesty in that study, with his hands folded and his voice low, he called it simply the wrongness. He did not know, when he stopped her, what she carried. He did not know about the cough that had been waited for, or the note that had been planted, or the thing that would be found folded in her physician's bag. He knew only that a woman he had never seen was walking with quiet, purposeful steps toward the door of a sleeping 8-year-old, at an hour when no true physician comes, and that everything in him that 6 years of that corridor had made said, "Not this door, not this child, not tonight." So he stepped out of the shadow, and he stood in her way, and he said the 4 words that stopped the entire scheme cold. "That door stays closed." I have pieced together what passed between them in that corridor from 3 sources. From Ashcott himself, who told it plainly and without varnish when the Queen asked him to. From the woman, whose own account came later and in a very different room. And from young Odell, the second watch guard who came up the stair midway through and saw the end of it. 3 tellings, and they agree on the shape of the thing, and the shape is this. It was not a struggle. It was not, for the longest while, even raised voices. It was 2 people standing very still in a dark hallway, each of them betting everything on the strength of a piece of paper, except that only one of them was holding a piece of paper, and the other was holding nothing but his own certainty, and in the end the nothing won. She did not startle when he spoke. That was the first thing Ashcott marked, and he set store by it, because he had frightened his share of people in dark corridors over the years, and he knew the involuntary jump of a person surprised. She did not jump. She turned toward him with a smooth, unhurried composure, the physician's bag steady in her left hand, and she looked at him with something that was almost warmth, the practiced, reassuring warmth of a woman whose whole profession, she meant him to believe, was the calming of frightened people in the middle of the night. "You must be the corridor guard," she said. "Good. I'm glad the princess is so well watched. I'm Dr. Vell. I'm expected." And she lifted the folded document a few inches, an easy, offering gesture, the gesture of a person who has nothing to hide and everything in order. "It's all here. The Chamberlain's office arranged it 2 days ago. I know the hour is dreadful, believe me. I'd rather be asleep. But with a chest complaint in a child of her age, one doesn't wait for morning." "It was," Ashcott said, "a very good performance. He wanted me to understand that. When he described her to the Queen, he did not describe a snarling villain or a nervous amateur. He described a calm, warm, articulate woman who said exactly the right things in exactly the right order, who knew the princess's age and the nature of her cough, and the name of the office that had supposedly sent her, and who held out her paperwork with the mild patience of someone quite used to being doubted by careful men, and quite used to those doubts dissolving the moment they read the seal. Everything she said was designed to make him feel the small, hot shame of the man who challenges a legitimate visitor, to make continuing the challenge feel not like duty but like rudeness, like officiousness, like a failure of the very trust he was there to serve. And it very nearly worked, because it was aimed at the exact place where a good guard is weakest, his fear of getting it wrong. "Show me the paper," Ashcott said. She handed it to him. She had to. A refusal would have undone everything. But she handed it to him the way you hand a document to a man you expect to be reassured by it, already half turning back toward the door, as though his reading of it were a formality to be endured before she went about her work. He unfolded it under the light of the single sconce, and he read it, and this is where the plotters had made their masterpiece, because the paper was very nearly perfect. It was an order of medical removal. That was the heading, in the stern formal hand of the Chamberlain's clerks, order for the medical removal and isolation of a person of the royal household. Beneath it, in dense official language, it authorized the bearer, Dr. Cachavel, consulting physician of children's diseases, named in full, to take the Princess Maelin from the palace that night, under her sole medical care, to a place of isolation and treatment, on the grounds that the child's condition was, or might be, contagious in a manner that endangered the health of the wider household and could not be safely managed within the residential wing. It cited a statute. It cited a precedent from 40 years before, a genuine one, when an infectious fever had indeed swept the palace and the young of the house had been removed for their safety. It bore the date of that very day. It bore the great embossed seal of the household in red wax at its foot, unbroken and true. And at the bottom, above the words "by Her Majesty's hand and will," it bore a signature. Saralind R. The Queen's own signature, or what looked, in the dim light of a corridor sconce at 11 at night, exactly like the Queen's own signature. A lesser guard would have been finished at that word. Removal, isolation, contagion, the health of the household. It was the perfect lie because it did not ask him to let a stranger harm the princess. It asked him to let a physician save her, and to save everyone else besides, and it dressed the taking of the child in the language of care and duty and the Queen's own express command. To refuse it was, on its face, to endanger the child and the household both. To refuse it was to set his own judgment against the signature of his sovereign. Every rule Ashcott had ever been taught told him that, when the Queen's hand and seal command a thing, the guard obeys. He read it twice. The woman, watching him, made the mistake of thinking his slowness was the slowness of a man being persuaded. It was not. Ashcott was not a scholar. He could not have told you the statute law of medical removal to save his life. But he had stood outside that child's door for 6 years, and he had seen the Queen come and go from it 1,000 times, and he knew certain things in his bones that no forger in the world could have known to counterfeit. He knew that the Queen had been in the residential wing that very evening, sitting with her daughter until nearly 9, and had said nothing, not one word, about the child being taken away in the night. He knew that a mother who had signed an order to remove her sick daughter from the palace before dawn does not spend that same evening reading her a story and kissing her good night as though nothing were the matter. And he knew this was the smallest thing and the largest, that when the Queen of Eldermoor signed a document that would take her child out of her own house into the dark, she would not have let that document be carried up a back stair by a stranger and handed to a corridor sergeant. She would have brought it herself. She would have come. She would have been standing in this corridor with her hand on her daughter's door, because that was the kind of mother she was, and Ashcott had watched her be that mother for 6 years. The paper was perfect. The paper was a lie. And the proof that it was a lie was not written anywhere on the paper. It was written in 6 years of standing in the dark, watching a family live. "This is the Queen's order," the woman said gently when he had read it the second time. "I know it's a hard thing, waking a sleeping child and taking her out into the cold. I don't like it either, but you can see it's all in order, Sergeant. Her Majesty has signed it. The seal is right there. Now will you let me do my work, or shall we stand here arguing statutes while the princess coughs?" And she reached, quite naturally, quite gently, for the small brass handle of the door. Ashcott put his hand flat against the door above hers, not roughly, but with the whole settled weight of a man who has made his decision, and he did not move it. "No," he said. It was, he told the Queen afterward, the hardest word he ever spoke in his life, and he had spoken it to what he believed at that moment might be her own signed command. He did not know yet that the signature was false. He had reasoned his way to distrust of it, but reasoning is a candle and instinct is the dark all around it. And there in the corridor, with the seal glowing red under the sconce and the princess coughing faintly beyond the door, a large and terrible part of him whispered that he might be about to ruin himself. That if that paper was real, if the Queen truly had signed it, then he was a sergeant of the guard standing in defiance of his sovereign, laying his hand against a door she had commanded opened. And there would be no forgiveness for it and no coming back. He said no anyway. That is the whole of the man in one word. The woman's warmth did not vanish all at once. She was too good for that. But it thinned, Ashcott said. It drew back at the edges the way frost draws back from a fire. And beneath it he began, for the first time, to see the shape of the thing that had come up his stair. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was still low, still reasonable, but there was iron laid into it now. "I don't think you understand your position. That document carries Her Majesty's signature and the seal of the household. It is a lawful order. If you obstruct it, you are not protecting the princess. You are defying the Queen, delaying urgent medical care, and endangering every soul under this roof. When Dr. Haveston and the Chamberlain learn in the morning that a corridor guard took it upon himself to overrule the Crown, do you imagine it will be the Crown that answers for it?" She let that sit a moment. "I am trying to help you. Step aside. Note in your log that you saw the order and the seal and did your duty, and no one will ever fault you. Refuse, and you will have thrown away 12 years of service to keep a sick child from a physician. Think, man. Whose side does that put you on?" It was, I have always thought, a beautifully constructed threat, because it did not threaten him with harm. It threatened him with being wrong, and with the ruin that comes to a servant of the Crown who oversteps. It offered him the safe road, paved and lit. Obey the paper, log it, and let the consequences fall where the paper said they should. Every word of it was aimed at the sergeant's most reasonable fear, that in his zeal to guard the child he would harm her and disgrace himself both. Men have been talked past far graver doors by far less. Ashcott did not move his hand. "If it's the Queen's order," he said, "then the Queen will confirm it. She's in the palace tonight. Wake her. Bring her here or take me to her, and if she tells me with her own mouth that this child leaves the palace tonight in your care, I'll carry the princess down to your carriage myself and hold the door. But no paper takes that girl out of that room. Only her mother's living voice does that, so we'll send for her mother." And there it was, the move the whole scheme could not survive, and had never planned for. The plotters had forged a signature. They had not been able to forge the Queen. Everything depended on the child being gone before anyone with the authority to ask the Queen a question was ever awake to ask it. A physician arrives late at night. A guard, cowed by the seal, steps aside. The child is carried down a back stair and into a waiting carriage and away. And by the time the Queen wakes and the household stirs and someone thinks to ask whether Her Majesty truly signed such a thing, the princess is a dozen miles gone into the dark. Held by people the palace itself waved through its gates, entirely lawfully, on excellent paper. The one thing the plot could not tolerate was delay of exactly this kind, a delay that ended with the Queen awake and asking. And Ashcott, who knew none of the plot, had reached straight for its throat by the shortest road. Don't argue the paper, ask the woman whose name is on it. That was the moment the woman's composure finally broke, and it broke not into fear but into calculation, the cold, fast recalculation of a professional whose plan has just struck a wall. Ashcott watched it happen behind her eyes. She glanced once down the corridor toward the stair, measuring the distance, measuring him, measuring whether force might still serve where paper had failed. She was not a large woman and he was a trained man, and she did not in the end try it, but for one heartbeat, he said, he saw her weigh it, and that single instant told him more than all her documents. An honest physician balked at a stubborn guard grows exasperated. She does not, for even a heartbeat, calculate an assault on the man between her and a sleeping child. Whatever else the paper claimed, that flicker was the truth of her. She had come to take the princess, and she had meant to take her tonight, and the question in her eyes was not whether she had the right, but only whether she still had the means. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, very quietly, and the warmth was entirely gone from her now, and something underneath it looked out at him plainly for the first time. "Then it's mine to make," Ashcott said. "Odell." He had heard the fourth stair creak. Young Odell, the second watchman, coming up on his rounds, 23 years old, 3 years in service, and to his lasting credit, he read the corridor in a single glance. The sergeant's hand flat on the princess's door, the stranger with a physician's bag standing too close, the air between them stretched taut as wire. He came up fast and quiet and put himself at Ashcott's shoulder without a word. "This visitor is leaving the residential wing," Ashcott said, still without raising his voice, still without taking his hand from the door. "Escort her down to the guardroom and hold her there courteously, comfortably, but she doesn't leave and she doesn't go anywhere near the family's rooms. Her bag and her papers stay with her and don't leave your sight. Then rouse the duty officer and send word up to the Queen's household that Sergeant Ashcott requests that Her Majesty be woken. Tell them it concerns the princess and it will not keep till morning." He looked at the woman then, for the first time, with something almost like courtesy. "If everything you carry is true, Doctor, then in 20 minutes the Queen will confirm it and I'll have delayed the princess's care by 1/3 of an hour and earned every reprimand you've promised me. I'll take that gladly, but we're not opening this door on a signature. Not this door." "I want to stop here and say something about that word, requests." Ashcott could have raised the alarm. He could have shouted, sounded the bell, brought the whole guard down on that corridor with weapons drawn. He did not, and his reasons were the reasons of a disciplined man, and they mattered enormously to what came after. He did not yet know the paper was forged. If it were real, an alarm raised against the Queen's own physician on the Queen's own order would have been a catastrophe, a scandal, a panic, a sick child terrified awake by shouting men, the household thrown into chaos over what might, for all he knew, be a lawful thing. So he chose the narrowest possible action that would still be enough. Hold the door, hold the woman, and wake the one person alive who could tell truth from forgery with a glance. Not because he was timid. Because he was right, and being right, he did not need to be loud. The measure of the man was not that he stopped her. It was that he stopped her without breaking a single thing that did not need breaking, and left the whole question resting exactly where it belonged, in the hands of the child's mother. Odell took the woman down. She went without resistance, which Ashcott noted and did not like, because a wronged physician resists, argues, demands names and consequences all the way down the stair. And this woman went quiet and composed and thinking. And a person who is thinking that hard on the way to a guardroom is a person deciding what to say and what to burn. And Ashcott stood alone again at the head of the corridor, his hand still on the door long after there was any need for it, and waited for the Queen. I was the one who woke her. I had gone to bed late, as I often did, in the small chamber off the Queen's private apartments where I slept when she asked me to stay near, and I was not yet asleep when the tap came at my door, the duty officer, a good steady man named Fenwick, ashen in the candlelight, with a message he clearly did not know how to weigh. There was, he said, a situation on the residential corridor. Sergeant Ashcott had detained a woman claiming to be a physician sent to remove the princess, and was refusing to let her pass on a signed order, and requested, he stumbled on the word, as Ashcott had known everyone would, that Her Majesty be woken to confirm or deny the order herself. Fenwick did not know if he had the right to wake the Queen for such a thing. He did not know if the sergeant had lost his mind or saved the child. He knew only that a paper with the Queen's signature was sitting in the guardroom, and a guard was standing against it, and that above his pay and below the Queen's, there was no one who could decide which of those things to believe. That is why he came to me. It was my particular office in that household to be the person who could wake the Queen, and more than that, the person who knew, better than any minister, when a thing was worth waking her for. I listened to Fenwick for the length of about 4 sentences, and I felt the cold come into me, not fear yet, but the near cousin of it, the sense of a floor you thought was solid giving the faintest flex underfoot. A signed order to remove the princess. In the night. That the Queen had never mentioned. I had sat with Saralind that very evening while she wrote her letters. She had spoken of her daughter's cough with the ordinary worry of a mother and nothing more, and she had said, quite clearly, that Haveston expected the child mended within the week, and that there was no cause for alarm. She had said nothing of a specialist, or a removal, or a night carriage. And a queen does not sign her own child out of her own house, and then forget to mention it to the woman who reads her every letter. I woke her. I have woken Saralind of Eldermoor perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, always for grave things, and she woke as she always did, instantly, completely, without the fog that clings to ordinary sleepers, her mind already reaching for the shape of the trouble before her eyes were fully open. I told her what Fenwick had told me, in as few words as I could make it, and I watched her face while I said them. When I reached the word order, a signed order to remove Maelin, something happened in her expression that I have never forgotten and did not at the time understand. She did not look confused. A woman told that she had signed a thing she did not remember signing might reasonably look confused. Saralind looked, for one flickering instant, afraid, and not the plain fear of a mother told her child is in danger, though that was there too. It was a more particular fear, a knowing fear, the fear of a person who has just felt something long dreaded finally arrive. I did not read it then. I read it later when I knew what she knew, and by then it had a name. Take me to my daughter, she said. That was all. She did not send for ministers. She did not dress for court. She put a heavy robe over her nightgown and pushed her feet into slippers and went out into the cold corridors of her own palace at midnight with her hair loose and her face bare, because there was, in the whole ordering of her mind, exactly one thing that mattered, and it was the child behind a door on the 3rd floor of the west wing. I went with her, carrying a lamp. Fenwick went ahead. And behind us, roused by the movement, came others, a lady of the household, 2 more guards, the chamberlain's own night secretary, all the small machinery of a palace waking to trouble. But the Queen outpaced all of them. I remember almost running to keep the lamp near her, and I remember that she did not say one word the whole way, and that her silence was the loudest thing I have ever walked beside. When we came up the west stair and onto the residential corridor, Ashcott was where he had been for the better part of an hour, at his post at the princess's door, his hand no longer on it but his body still squarely between it and the world. He came to attention when he saw the queen, and I watched him take in the fact of her, bare-faced, night-robed, come herself in person at midnight, and I watched something settle in him because that fact alone was already his answer. The queen had come. The living voice he had demanded stood before him. Whatever the paper said, the woman whose name was on it was here, awake, asking questions, exactly as she never would have been if the order were real and routine. "Sergeant," the queen said, "where is my daughter?" "Asleep, your majesty." "Behind that door, safe. She has not been disturbed." He said it first before anything else because he understood what she needed before she needed anything else, and I have always honored him for that. Only when he saw her shoulders come down a fraction, only when he saw the mother's terror ease into something a queen could think through, did he go on. "There is a woman in the guardroom below who came up an hour ago with a physician's bag and a signed order. The order commands the princess be removed from the palace tonight into her sole care, for isolation, on account of the cough. It bears your signature, ma'am, and the household seal. I would not open the door on it. I ask that you be woken to say whether it is yours." "Give me the order," the queen said. Odell had brought it up. It had been carried under guard the whole way, never out of sight, exactly as Ashcott had commanded. And that small discipline mattered more than any of us yet knew, because it meant that what the queen was about to hold in her hands was the very paper as it had arrived, untouched, unaltered, its every mark intact. Odell handed it to me, and I unfolded it, and I held it up into the light of my own lamp so that the queen could read it, and I read it too, over her shoulder, and my blood went cold in stages as I understood what it claimed. Removal, isolation, the child taken out of the palace into the night, into the sole care of a woman none of us had ever seen, on a paper that swore the queen herself had willed it. I looked at the seal, the true seal, the household's own, red and deep and perfect. I looked at the statute cited, and the precedent, and the date, all of it exactly as such a document should be. And I looked last at the signature at the foot of it, above the words by Her Majesty's hand and will. Saralind R. And beside me, the Queen of Eldermoor looked at her own name written on that page, in a hand so like her own that even I, who had read 1,000 of her letters, felt a lurch of doubt, and she went very, very still. "I did not sign this," she said. She said it quietly, and she said it with complete certainty. And then, "This is the part I have never been able to forget," she said it again, more slowly, and the certainty in her voice had changed into something else. "I did not sign this, but," and here her thumb moved across the letters of her own name, across the loop of the S and the tail of the final flourish, tracing them the way you trace a thing you cannot believe you are seeing. "But this is my hand." I did not understand her then. I thought she was contradicting herself, denying the signature and confessing it in the same breath. It was Ashcott, of all people, who understood her first, because Ashcott had spent his life learning to tell a true thing from a false one that has been made to look true, and he heard in the queen's voice the exact note he had heard in himself an hour before, at the door. The note of a person confronting a lie so well built that the lie and the truth wear the same face. "It's a forgery, ma'am," he said gently. "But a good one." "It is not a good one, Sergeant," the queen said, and she lowered the paper and she looked at him, and I saw in her face the arrival of the thing she had feared on the pillow when I woke her, the thing with a name she had not yet spoken aloud. "It is a perfect one. Do you understand? Look at it. This is not a clumsy copy made by someone who once glimpsed my signature on a proclamation. Whoever wrote my name on this page has seen my private hand, not my public signature, the flourish I put on decrees, but the way I actually write, the small habits I do not even know I have. The way I close the S, the pressure I put on the final stroke. This was written by someone who has studied my letters, my real letters. The ones that never leave my private rooms." The corridor had gone silent. The lady of the household, the guards, Fenwick, the chamberlain's night secretary, All of them had drawn up behind us in the last minute, and all of them heard it, and I felt the silence change its character, the way the air changes before a storm. Because the Queen had just said, in front of all of us, the thing that turned this from a foiled intruder into something far darker. A stranger had not simply walked in off the street with a bad copy of the royal signature. A stranger could not have made this page. This page had been made by someone with access to the Queen's private correspondence, her personal letters, kept under lock in her own apartments, seen by almost no one. And the seal at its foot was not a forgery at all. I looked at it again harder and my stomach dropped because I knew that seal. It was not a copy. It was the true household seal, the great matrix itself, which lived in the Chamberlain's strong room and was pressed to only the most solemn documents of the crown, and which no forger anywhere could have counterfeited to that depth and that perfection, because it was not counterfeited. It was real. Someone had taken the true seal of the household and pressed it, with their own hand, to a lie. The Queen understood all of this faster than I could, because it was her palace and her seal in her hand, and she stood in that cold corridor at midnight, and I watched her assemble the pieces one by one, and I watched her face close like a door. "This did not come from outside my house," she said very low. "Whoever made this walked my private corridors, they read my letters, they opened the strong room. They knew my daughter had a cough 3 days ago and knew it before I did anything about it because they had been waiting for it." She looked down again at the paper, at the impossible, intimate accuracy of her own forged name. "This is not a thief at my gate. This is someone at my table." And there it was, the whole ground of the thing shifting under our feet. Until that moment, even with the woman in the guardroom and the false order in her hand, the story could still have been the small kind. A lone impostor, an outside plot, a danger that ended when the door held. Now it was the other kind. The danger had not come up the stair from the street. It had come down the stair from inside, from the private wing, the strong room, the inner circle, the small handful of people trusted with the Queen's letters and the household seal and the daily secrets of a child's health. The woman in the guardroom was not the plot. She was the hand of it, the instrument, the physician sent to carry the parcel away. The plot itself lived somewhere above her, somewhere close, somewhere the Queen had trusted so completely that she had never once thought to guard against it. I saw Saralind reach that conclusion, and I saw what it cost her. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept in corridors in front of her guards. But the color went out of her face by degrees, and her hand, holding the lamplit page, was not quite steady. And when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and careful in the way a person's voice goes when they are holding something very heavy and refusing to let it show that it is heavy. "Sergeant Ashcott," she said, "you were told this was my signature, my lawful order. You were told that to refuse it was to defy your Queen and endanger your career and delay care to a sick child. Is that so?" "It is, ma'am." "And you refused it anyway?" "I did." "Why?" she said, and it was not a challenge, it was almost a plea. She needed, I think, to hear how a man had known what she herself, holding the paper, had needed a full minute to be sure of. The seal was true. The paper was perfect. My own name was on it. Every rule you served told you to obey it. Why did you set your judgment against the Crown's own hand on nothing?" "Not on nothing, ma'am." Ashcott's voice was quiet and even and entirely without pride. "On 6 years of standing outside that door. I've watched you come to her every night you're in the palace. I've watched you sit with her when she's ill. I know what you're like with her." He paused, and for the first time something moved in his face, some feeling breaking the discipline of it. "If you meant to take your own daughter out of this house in the dark, ma'am, into a stranger's care, sick, you'd have come. You'd not have sent a paper up a back stair to a corridor guard. You'd have carried her down yourself. So when a woman I'd never seen tried to walk that child out on your name and you weren't there, I knew the name was a lie before I knew anything else about it. The paper could be perfect. It couldn't be you." The Queen looked at him for a long moment, and then she said the thing that I have carried with me ever since, the thing that told me what kind of ruler she truly was. "You knew me," she said, "better than the people who forged my hand." Then she gave the lamp to me, and she opened her daughter's door herself, softly, the way she must have opened it 1,000 nights, and she went in alone. I stood in the doorway and I watched, because she did not ask me not to, and it is the one part of that night I will keep to myself in the telling except for this. The princess was asleep, curled small under her blankets with her nightlight burning low, entirely unharmed, entirely unaware that a woman had stood 40 feet from where she dreamed with a paper meant to carry her off into the dark. The queen bent over her and did not wake her. She put her hand very lightly on the child's hair, and she stood there a moment with her eyes closed, and then she straightened, and when she turned back to the corridor her face had changed again. The fear was gone. What had replaced it was colder and steadier, and I thought, far more dangerous to whoever had done this. A frightened mother is one thing. A queen who has just seen how close the danger came, and has mastered her fear, and now means to find its source, that is another thing entirely. "She's not to be moved," the queen said, coming out and drawing the door softly closed. "Not tonight, not by anyone, not on any order, not if it carries my own signature 10 times over. Sergeant Ashcott, you will remain at this post, and you will admit no one to this room but myself and Dr. Haveston, whom I will send for personally and vouch for by my own face. Not by paper, by my face. Do you understand me? We do not trust paper in this house tonight. Guardsman Odell, double the watch on this corridor. Fenwick, I want the residential wing sealed, no one in or out until I say otherwise, and I want it done quietly. No bells, no alarm, no waking my son. Whoever arranged this is inside these walls, and I will not have them warned by the sound of the house panicking. We move as if nothing has happened. Is that clear to everyone standing here?" It was clear. It was, I remember thinking, extraordinary, the speed with which she had gone from a woman shaking in her nightgown to a commander laying out a cordon, and the coldness with which she had grasped the single most important fact, which was that the enemy was watching from inside and must not know how much we knew. She did not raise her voice once. She sealed her own house against a traitor she could not yet name, and she did it in whispers, at midnight, in a nightgown, and every hardened man in that corridor moved to obey her as though she wore a crown and armor. Then she said, "Now take me to the woman." The guardroom was a low, warm, stone-floored chamber off the ground-floor passage, and the woman who called herself Dr. Cachevel was sitting in it under Odell's men, composed, upright, her physician's bag on the table before her, untouched, still exactly as it had come down because Ashcott's order had held all the way through. She rose when the queen entered, and she inclined her head with a perfect, cool courtesy, and she did not look like a woman caught in a monstrous crime. She looked like a professional who had been inconvenienced and was waiting with strained patience for the misunderstanding to be cleared up. And for one moment, I will be honest, even knowing what I knew, even having read the forged order with my own eyes, the sheer unshaken calm of her made me doubt. That is how good she was. That is how good the whole thing was. "Your Majesty," she said, "I am glad you've come. There has been a serious error tonight, and a devoted sergeant has, with the best of intentions, obstructed urgent care to your daughter. I hold no grudge against him, he did as he thought right, but I must ask that we resolve this quickly. The princess's condition." "My daughter is asleep and well," the queen said, "as you know perfectly because you never examined her and never meant to. Sit down." The woman sat. "You will tell me," the queen said, "who sent you." And here came the false dawn, the moment where the whole matter seemed, for a breath, about to be solved, tied off, delivered whole. Because the woman did not deny it. She had been caught too cleanly. The paper was forged and the queen alive to say so. There was no version of the innocent physician left to play. So she changed her performance smoothly, as a skilled liar does when one mask fails, and she reached instead for the mask of the penitent, the small, cornered, cooperating criminal who gives up her masters to save herself. She lowered her eyes. She let her composure crack artfully at exactly the seams you would expect, and she began to talk. She told us, and it came out fluently, almost eagerly, that she was no physician at all, that she had been hired for a great sum by a man she had met only twice, in a city inn, a man who gave no name but paid in advance and provided everything. The coat, the bag, the papers, the note that had gone ahead to the chamberlain's office, all of it. She had been told the princess was to be quietly taken to a country house for reasons of state that were above her to question, a custody matter, a family dispute among the great, nothing that concerned a hired woman doing a lawful-looking job for good coin. She had believed, she said, that the paper was genuine. She had not known, how could she have known, that it was forged. She was as much a victim of the thing as anyone. She would tell us everything about the man at the inn. She would help us find him. She only asked for mercy and protection and a chance to make it right. It was, I have to say, a magnificent performance, and it very nearly did what it was built to do, which was to send us all charging off after a nameless man in a distant inn, an outsider, a hireling's hireling, a trail that led away from the palace and out into the wide anonymous world where it would dissolve into nothing. It reframed the whole night as an external plot, foiled at the door, its foreign author already fled beyond reach. It asked us to be satisfied. It asked us to stop looking inside the house. And Saralind, watching her, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she picked up the forged order from the guardroom table where it lay, and she held it out toward the woman, not to give it to her but to make her look at it, and she said, "You say you did not know it was forged. I believe you. I think you truly did not know, but look at it. Look at my name. The man at your inn did not write that. The man at your inn could no more copy my private hand than you could. This was written by someone who has read my letters, that live behind a lock in a room in this palace that 4 people in the world may enter, and the seal beneath it is not a copy. It is the true seal of my household which lives in a strong room that 3 people in the world may open." She lowered the paper. "Your man at the inn is a wall, doctor. He is there to be found and to lead us nowhere and to make us believe this came from outside. But it did not come from outside. You were the hand, he was the wall, and behind the wall is someone I dine with, someone I trust, someone in this house." Her voice did not rise, but something terrible came into it. "And you are going to help me find out which of them it is, not because you know his name, but because of what you were told and when, and by which door your instructions truly came." The woman's composure finally fully broke, and this time it was real. Not into tears, into fear. Because up until that moment she had believed, I think, that she understood the thing she was caught inside, a custody dispute among the great, a rich man's quiet abduction of an inconvenient child, ugly but comprehensible, the sort of crime a hired hand can rationalize. But the Queen had just shown her the true shape of it, that she had been an instrument in a plot woven inside the palace itself, by someone at the very summit of the household, someone who could reach the Queen's private letters and the Crown's own seal, and a plot like that does not leave its instruments alive to talk. The man at the inn was a wall for us to run into. But the woman herself was a loose end, and she understood all at once, sitting in that warm guardroom, that the people who had built something this careful had certainly planned for what to do with her once the child was delivered. She had thought she was a hired physician. She realized she was a witness, and witnesses to a thing like this do not, as a rule, enjoy long retirements. So she told the truth, then the real truth, or as much of it as she held, and it was not a name because she had been kept carefully from names, but it was better than a name. It was a door. Her instructions, she said, had not all come from the man at the inn. The coat and the bag and the coin, yes, those came from him. But the papers had come separately, later, by a different hand, delivered to her the previous evening by a palace messenger, a liveried man, at the servants' gate, in a sealed packet she had been told to open only when she reached the residential entrance. She had thought nothing of it. A palace messenger delivering palace papers seemed the most natural thing in the world. But now, pressed, she remembered details, the livery, the hour, the particular badge on the man's coat that marked which office within the household he served. And that badge, when she described it, was not a badge that any of us in that room could hear described without the blood leaving our faces, because it was not a badge from the stables or the kitchens or the general staff. It was the badge of the private household, the small, elite corps of servants who attended the innermost offices of the palace, the Queen's own apartments and the chamberlains, the rooms where the letters were kept and the seal was housed. The papers had come from inside the inner household. There was no longer any doubt of it, and now the ring of people who could be responsible had narrowed from the whole vast palace to a handful, the handful the Queen trusted most. She took me back up to her private study. Then, in the deep middle of the night, with the wing sealed and Ashcott at the door and the false physician held under a doubled guard, and she and I did the thing that solved it, and it was not done with soldiers or force. It was done with paper, with the very letters the forger had studied, and with the household's own records of who could touch what and when. She unlocked the cabinet where her private correspondence lived, the letters the forger had learned her hand from, and we looked first at who in 11 years had ever had lawful cause to be alone with those letters. It was a short list, and it grew shorter as we struck off the dead and the departed and the plainly impossible, and it kept coming back again and again to the same small number of trusted intimates whose duties brought them into that room. Myself, 2 long-serving clerks of unimpeachable record, the Queen's late secretary's successor, and 1 other. Then she sent Fenwick quietly for the strong-room log, the register that recorded every single time the true household seal was taken from its place, by whom, and for what document, because whoever had pressed that real seal to that false order had been forced, by the palace's own careful rules, to sign for it. We laid the 2 lists side by side on the study table under my lamp, and the Queen ran her finger down them, the list of those who could reach her letters and the list of those who had drawn the seal, looking for the single name that appeared on both, the one person in all the world who had both learned her private hand and held her true seal, and I watched her finger stop, and I watched her go still for the 3rd time that night, and this time she did not go pale. This time she went gray. Because there was a name on both lists. Of course there was, the plot could not have existed otherwise. But it was not a clerk's name, and it was not a stranger's name, and it was not the name of anyone she could have struck off with relief and gone back to bed. It was a name she had spoken with affection 10,000 times. It was a name that had stood beside her at her coronation, and at her husband's side, and at the christening of the very child the order had been written to steal. It was the name of the one man in the whole household whose access to both the letters and the seal was so complete, so ordinary, so entirely beyond question, that in all our narrowing and striking off neither of us had thought, until that instant, to write it down at all, because you do not think to suspect the roof of your own house of falling until you feel it move. I will not even now set down the whole of what she said. Some of it belongs only to her, but I will tell you the name of the office, because the office is what makes the horror plain. He was the Lord Chamberlain of the household, the highest servant of the crown, the man who ran the palace, who ordered its coal and its candles and the movement of every visitor through its gates, whose seal governed our lives, whose office had sent the note 2 days before that told the residential staff to expect a consulting physician at an unusual hour, whose messenger had carried the sealed packet to the servant's gate. The man whose signature and seal were so woven into the ordinary running of the house that a forged order under his authority had sailed past Perrin and every checkpoint without a ripple, because it was, in the most literal sense, coming from the very hand that made the rules. He had not needed to break into the strong room. He kept the key to it. He had not needed to steal the Queen's letters. He was one of the 4 souls permitted to read them. He had not needed to counterfeit the seal. He was its keeper. The plot had not slipped past the palace's defenses. It had been written by the palace's defenses. The Lord Chamberlain had turned the entire apparatus of trust, the seals, the notes, the credentials, the smooth machinery by which a great house runs on faith, into a weapon pointed at the one child sleeping at the top of the west stair. And the only thing in all of Harrowgate that had not bowed to that apparatus, the single point of failure in a perfect design, was a sergeant at a door who trusted what he had seen with his own eyes over what was written under any seal on earth. "Iris," the Queen said, very quietly, staring at the name, "do you understand what this means?" If Ashcott had stepped aside, and every rule I have ever written told him to step aside, my daughter would be gone. Carried out of my house on my own name, through my own gates by my own chamberlain's arrangement, and I would have woken in the morning to a forged order that everyone in this palace would have believed because it was perfect, because it came from him. There would have been no alarm, no broken lock, no sign of a crime at all. Only a sick child taken to isolation on the Queen's command, and by the time I learned I had commanded no such thing, she would have been beyond any reach of mine. She looked up at me, and her eyes were dry and enormous. One man between her and that. And I did not even know his name until tonight. What followed, she did with the same cold quiet she had shown all night. She did not send guards crashing through the palace to drag the chamberlain from his bed. She had learned, in the space of one night, exactly how much damage a warning could do, and she would not give him one. Instead, she had Fenwick invite him, courteously, as if for an ordinary late consultation on the matter of the princess's health, which the whole household by now knew had prompted some disturbance, to attend Her Majesty in her private study. He came within the quarter hour, and he came, I must tell you, so perfectly in the character of himself that even then, even knowing, I felt the ground tilt. He was a tall, silver, dignified man of 60-some years, the Lord Chamberlain, with a manner so settled and so benign that 30 years of the household had leaned on it like a beam. He came into the study in a dressing gown of dark wine-colored silk, with the mild, concerned, faintly weary expression of a devoted old servant roused by a fuss over a child's cold, and he bowed to the Queen and said how sorry he was to hear there had been some confusion in the residential wing, and asked, with every appearance of grandfatherly worry, whether the dear princess was quite well. And I stood against the wall with my lamp, and I thought, this is the face. This is the face he wore to breakfast every morning of my 11 years. This is the face that ordered our candles and signed our passes and stood at the christening, and behind it, the whole time, was the man who wrote the Queen's name on a page to steal her child. The Queen let him finish. Then she laid the forged order on the table between them face up, and she said only, "Read me the signature." I have never seen a man's soul leave his face the way his did in that instant. It was not dramatic. There was no cry, no denial, no lunge for the door. It was quieter and more total than any of those. The small, absolute collapse of a mask that has been worn so long it had grown into the skin, and the sudden showing through of the thing beneath, which was old and tired and calculating, and when it saw that the game was truly and finally lost, almost relieved. He looked at the paper. He looked at the true seal at its foot, his own seal, drawn on his own signature from his own strong room. He looked at the Queen's forged name, which he had studied from her private letters over I do not know how many careful hours, and he understood in one glance that she knew all of it, the letters, the seal, the packet, the badge, the door, and that there was nothing left to perform. So, he said, the corridor guard, and he almost smiled. I told them the guard was nothing, the one thing I did not account for, all of it perfect, Your Majesty, the note, the papers, the seal, the woman, the hour, the timing, the man at the inn to lead you nowhere. Everything a house of rules could throw against me, I had already made to serve me because I made the rules. And it came apart on a sergeant who would not read. He shook his silver head slowly. I have spent 30 years teaching this household to trust paper. I forgot to account for the one man who trusts his eyes." And then the Queen asked him the question I had been dreading and needing in equal measure. The question that was the whole reason any of us were standing in that room at 2 in the morning. The question that, when he answered it, left her without a single word to say. "Why," she said, "why my daughter, why Maelin?" And he told her. He had not meant to harm the child. He said this first, and God help me, I believed him, and so, I think, did she, which was somehow the worst part of all. The princess was never to be touched. She was to be taken to a country house, comfortable and warm, attended and safe, and she was to be kept there, unharmed, for as long as it took. Because Maelin, he explained, in the calm, reasonable voice of a man laying out an administrative necessity, was not the target. She was the lever. The whole architecture of the plot rested on a single fact of statute that the Queen, in the shock of the night, had not yet had cause to think about, and when he said it, I saw her think about it, and I saw it land. There was a law of the realm, old and half forgot, concerning the succession and the regency, that if a reigning sovereign should be, for a defined period, unable to produce or account for the safety and whereabouts of the direct heirs of the body, the governance of the realm passed provisionally to a council of regency, and that the council of regency, by that same ancient statute, was chaired in the sovereign's incapacity by the highest officer of the household, by the Lord Chamberlain, by him. He had not needed to harm the Queen, or the King Consort, or the children. He had needed only to remove one child cleanly, lawfully, invisibly on the Queen's own apparent order, so that the crown could not account for the whereabouts of a direct heir, and to hold her, unharmed, in that quiet country house, just long enough for the machinery of that forgotten statute to grind into motion and deliver the regency, and the realm into his hands. The child would have been returned, eventually, safe and well, once the transfer of power was beyond undoing. He had planned every step of it. He had planned it for years. He had, he said, waited only for the child to fall ill with something small and ordinary and deniable, a cough, a chill, anything that would make a medical removal plausible, and then he had moved, and but for one sergeant at one door he would have one, and no one would ever have known a crime had been committed at all, because every document would have been perfect and every rule would have been kept, and the Queen herself would have appeared to command her own undoing. That was what the Queen learned, standing in her own study at 2 in the morning, holding a paper with her own forged name upon it. She learned that the danger to her daughter had never been a stranger, or a madman, or a thief in the night. She learned that it had been the most trusted man in her house, that it had been aimed not at the child's life, but at the child's mere absence, that it had been designed to use the Queen's own love and the Crown's own laws and the palace's own machinery of trust as the very instruments of the theft, and that the entire perfect apparatus of it, 30 years in the trusting and years in the building, had been stopped by nothing grander than a sergeant of the guard, who had stood outside a door long enough to know a mother's heart better than a forger knew her hand, and Saralind of Eldermoor, who had commanded a cordon in her nightgown and mastered her terror, and traced a conspiracy to its root in a single night, Saralind, who I had never in 11 years known to be at a loss for the right word in the gravest hour, opened her mouth to answer him, and found that there was nothing in her to say. She looked at the man she had trusted with everything, and at the paper that wore her own name, and at the door far above where her daughter slept on, unknowing, saved, and she said nothing at all. She could not. There are betrayals so total and rescues so narrow that the whole of language falls away from them, and a queen is left as speechless as any other mother who has just learned how close she came to losing her child, and to whom, and by how little. She stood there in the silence for a long time. When she spoke again, it was not to him. The Chamberlain, I think, had expected fury or a reckoning, some grand collision he could measure himself against. A man who has built his life on the machinery of the great understands power best when it thunders. What the Queen gave him instead was worse. She simply turned away from him, turned, as though he had already ceased to be a person and become only a piece of business to be handed to others, and she said to Fenwick evenly, "Take him." Quietly. No irons where the household can see, no shouting, no spectacle. He is not to speak to anyone. He is not to send or receive a single word, and he does not go near the strong room or my apartments ever again. Change the locks tonight. Change the seal. By dawn I want every key he ever held accounted for. And then to the chamberlain himself, the only words she spoke to him directly, in a voice with nothing left in it but a vast and final cold. You will never see either of my children again. Not through a window, not across a courtyard. You have looked at them for the last time. He was led out, and he went the way such men go once the mask is off, smaller and older and silent. And I never saw him again, and neither did she. The rest was the slow, thorough machinery of setting a thing right, and it took weeks, not minutes, and I will not weary you with all of it. The man at the inn was a wall, as the Queen had said, and led nowhere, as he had been paid to. But the woman who called herself Dr. Vell, once she understood that her only road out of the plot alive ran through the Queen's protection, gave up everything she had, the packet, the badge, the messenger, the hours, the sequence. And it was more than enough, laid against the strong-room log and the household records, to make the case beyond any doubt. She was dealt with according to the law, but not harshly. She had been an instrument, knowing far less than she'd sold herself to do, and the Queen, who understood the difference between the hand and the will behind it, saw that the distinction was honored. The conspiracy, it turned out, had reached beyond the chamberlain to two others of the inner household who had helped him, the messenger, and a clerk who had turned a blind eye to a strong-room entry that should have been questioned. And they were found and removed, and the whole quiet rot of it cut out of the house root and branch in silence, without a single public word, exactly as the Queen had commanded on the first night. Eldermoor never knew how close it came to waking one morning under a council of regency chaired by a traitor. That, too, was mercy of a kind. A realm does not need to carry the knowledge of a wound that was healed before it ever bled. But the part of it that I was there for, the part that matters, happened before any of that, in the last dark hour of the same night, and it was small, and I have kept it closest of all. When the chamberlain had been taken away and the study was quiet, the Queen went back up the west stair to the residential corridor. It was near 3 by then, the coldest hour, and the whole thing had been contained so gently that the corridor looked exactly as it had at dusk. The portraits watching, the single sconce burning, and Sergeant Bram Ashcott at his post outside the princess's door, precisely where he had stood when the woman first came, precisely where he had stood all through the long unraveling below, because no one had told him to stand down, and he would not leave that door until someone did. The Queen stopped in front of him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and I stood back with my lamp and let them have it. "Sergeant," she said at last, "do you know what you stopped tonight?" "No, ma'am," he said honestly. "I know I stopped a woman with a paper. I've heard some of the rest. I don't think I've heard all of it, and I don't think I need to." "You stopped the theft of my daughter," the Queen said, "and the theft of my crown, and you did it against every rule I have ever given you, on nothing but the fact that you knew what kind of mother I am. If you had obeyed the order, the lawful order, the perfect order, the one that carried my own name and would have ended your career to refuse, she would be gone, and I would be a queen in name only by summer, and no one, Sergeant, no one in all my house full of clever, trusted, well-instructed men would have raised a hand to stop it. Only you, the man I was least likely to ever thank, at the post no one wants, doing the duty no one watches." She was quiet a moment. "I do not have a word large enough, so I will not reach for one. I will only tell you that as long as I am queen, and as long as my children are children, you will guard whatever door you choose, and answer to no order over their safety but my living voice, and that this house will remember, even if the world outside it never learns the tale, that everything was saved by the one man who trusted his eyes over my seal." Ashcott, who had stood unmoved through threats and a forged command and the whole weight of the crown pressing him to step aside, was undone at last, not by any of that but by her thanks. He did not weep, but something in his jaw worked, and he had to look for a moment at the floor before he could bring his eyes back up and say, quite simply, "I only stood at the door, ma'am." "It's the whole of the job." "It is the whole of the job," the Queen agreed softly, "and you are the only one who did it." Then she went past him, and she opened her daughter's door for the second time that night, and this time she did not stand in the doorway. She went in, and she sat on the edge of the small bed, and she gathered the sleeping princess up into her arms, and the child stirred and murmured and settled against her mother without ever fully waking, without ever knowing, without ever having to know that anything at all had happened in the dark outside her door. The nightlight burned. The cough had eased. The Queen held her and rocked her the smallest amount, and over the child's dark hair she looked out through the open door to where the sergeant stood at his post with his eyes forward, guarding them both. That is the picture I have kept. Not the forged order, not the chamberlain's ruined face, not the woman in the guardroom or the statue or the near loss of a crown. Just that. A mother holding a child who would never have to be afraid, and a still man at a door who had made sure of it, and the two of them joined across the threshold by a thing that had no name and needed none. People ask me when I tell this story, what became of Bram Ashcott? They want the grand ending, the promotion, the medal, the great office. He was offered things, and he took almost none of them. He was not a man who had done it for the reward, and reward sat awkwardly on him. He stayed on the residential corridor for 11 more years, guarding those children until they were grown and needed no such guarding, and then he retired quietly to a small house in the country, and as far as I know, never told the tale to a living soul. He did not think it was his to tell. He thought he had only stood at a door. But I was there. I held the lamp. I saw the Queen of Eldermoor rendered speechless by the truth of what one ordinary, disciplined, immovable man had done, and I decided long ago that the world should have it right, even if it never has his name. He stopped a woman outside a young princess's room. The item in her hands was a perfect forged order, sealed and signed in the Queen's own stolen hand, meant to carry a child out of her own house on her own mother's counterfeit will. And the thing that stopped it, the only thing in all of Harrowgate that a lifetime's perfect plotting had not been able to forge, or buy, or command, or account for, was a guardsman who knew in his bones that no paper on earth outweighs a door you have sworn to hold. That is the whole of it. That is what happened. And that is why to this day in the household of Eldermoor, when someone wants to say that a thing is true past any argument, past any seal or signature or clever proof, they say, "I'd stake it on the sergeant's eyes."